and talk about what you and I discussed at length in the previous podcast, the China-US relationship. How do things look from Beijing's perspective, including the last 4 years of Biden administration and the coming 4 years of Trump administration?
I think here again, it's very important to make a distinction between the structural changes and the short-term developments. Excuse me. Structurally, the relationship between US and China is shifting. I mean, the Americans are obviously trying to stop China's development. They think to some extent they have done so. But if you take a 10-year time horizon, no way they're going to stop China. So the Chinese still feel confident that the long run, they'll be better off. The Chinese economy, as you know, is having some real short-term challenges. The next 2-3 years will be difficult. The real estate market is still in the dumps. Consumer sentiment is down. Business sentiment is down. So they're struggling to get their 5% growth rate. So over the next 2 to 3 years, Chinese economy is going to be struggling. But if you look at China decade by decade, at the end of each decade, they look so much stronger. And I gave already the statistic how their share of global manufacturing has gone from 5% in 2000 and will reach to 45% in 2030. That's an example of how this look decade by decade. And certainly, if you ask yourself a very simple question, which leading economy in the world has invested the most in the industries of the future? I mean, no question is China. Yeah? EVs, solar panels, wind turbines, battery technology, robots, you go on, right? And if there's one economy that's really prepared for the future, preparing itself for the future, is China. And it's causing structural changes around the world. I mean, if you and I had this interview 10 years ago, and I told you, Timur, 10 years ago, I told you in 2015, 10 years from now, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Audi, Toyota, Nissan, well, we're so scared of Chinese automobiles.
I would have looked at
You would have laughed at me. Everybody would have laughed. You must be joking. I remember as recently as 3-4 years ago, Elon Musk said, who the hell is going to buy a Chinese automobile? Look where we are today. All the companies I mentioned are shit scared of Chinese automobiles. So, this is, and just to mention an event that happened last few days, look at how much value NASDAQ has lost because of a company I never heard of called Deep State. Where did this Chinese company come from? And how does a hedge fund manager create a world-beating AI company? It doesn't make sense. So, therefore, what we have, the biggest lesson, and this is what I'm a friend of the United States. My goal is to help the United States adapt intelligently to the rise of the Chinese. And I always keep telling my American friends, it's very dangerous for you to underestimate China. It's safer for you to overestimate China. And to be fair to me, I've been saying this for 20, 30 years, consistently. And so with these structural changes happening, the rebalancing between US and China will continue. Now, over the short term, I think China is probably going to have a rough time initially with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump, as you know, only believes in working through threats and tariffs and so on and so forth. So there'll be some rockiness in the US-China relationship. But at the same time, if there's one man who can make a deal with China, a comprehensive deal with China, it is certainly Donald Trump. Joe Biden and his administration were so frightened of being seen to be soft on China, they didn't dare to do even the obvious things they could have done to improve ties with China. Donald Trump has got the advantage. They say only Richard Nixon could go to China. Only Donald Trump can make a deal with China. And at some point in time, if they reach a deal of some kind and stabilize the US China relationship, I wouldn't be surprised either. So, and this means that all the other people around the world, like the Europeans, who were counting on an adversarial US China relationship, will suddenly find themselves marginalized. So, this is the sort of thing that you got to be geopolitics is a very cruel business. You got to think very hard about how you could, on the one hand, enhance your position, and on the other hand, how your position could be seriously suffer if other changes happen.
Like, sure, the mercurial nature of Trump is really something else. To your point of the Biden administration being petrified of just being seen soft on China, they basically co-opted all the measures that Trump had put in place, and they intensified them, including the ban on TikTok. And then Trump comes back and he says, yeah, maybe we shouldn't ban it.
Yeah.
So what was the point of trying to look even holier than thou for the Biden
Yeah.
administration? It didn't really amount to anything. But just staying it.
Just a quick point.
Sure.
The bigger problem with the Biden administration is that they didn't have long-term strategic thinkers in the administration. I can tell you that in my last one-on-one conversation with Henry Kissinger in October 2022, about a year before he died, he more or less suggested that they're not thinking long-term and company with China. You got to ask yourself where you want to be 10 years, 20 years from now. Forget the next quarter, forget the tariffs and all that. What is your end goal? And the Biden administration never specified what his end goal is going to be 10 years, 20 years down the road. And what has shocked me even more is that not a single member of the Biden administration consulted Henry Kissinger. And the least they could have done, at least, to show some courage, is allow Henry Kissinger to go back to China in 2021 to mark the 50th anniversary of the opening up with China. But they were so scared, they didn't even allow Kissinger to go to China.
Right.
So that's an example of cowardice that unfortunately plagued the Biden administration.
Yeah, I've looked at various speeches that Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken gave over the last 4 years. And I felt that it was a continuation of whatever they thought the Trump administration had done, that we got to be even tougher than that, a little wide yard and high fence and those sort of analogy. It was all about looking at China as an existential adversary, as opposed to looking at the gains from a win-win relationship of openness.
And the Biden administration especially, because it genuinely, the biggest compliment I can pay the Biden administration is that they understood that climate change was a real threat. And it is a real threat, come on. Now, if climate change is a real threat, and you really want to focus on saving planet Earth, then you got to press the pause button on the geopolitical contest with China and tell China, hey, we are both two cabins on one boat. The boat is sinking. Let's work together. But the Biden administration, even though it realized that climate change is real, didn't have the courage to tell the American people, hey, we really got to save the planet. And the only way we can save the planet is if all of us come together, and we must bring China on board. That's a very simple, obvious thing the Biden administration could have said. But all they wanted to show is that they were tougher on China than the Trump administration. And it was a losing game.
I agree. Let's go back to the point you made about Xi Jinping's Davos speech about China, jumping into the rough waters of globalization and coming out stronger. If we assume that the narrative of fragmentation continues in the US and Europe, they see China as an adversary and they restrict market access, technology access, and so on. What is China's strategy vis-a-vis the other 85% of the world?
Well, I think the China strategy vis-a-vis the other 85% of the world started more than 10 years ago. With things like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, And, a Brazilian diplomat told me that in the year 2000, it took Brazil 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Today, it takes Brazil 60 to 70 hours to export $1 billion to China. So, remember, Brazil is in theory in the American sphere of influence, and Brazil is covered by the Monroe Doctrine and so on and so forth. So here is a country that has developed extensive ties with China. It's not going to sacrifice its ties with China just because of the United States. So what the Chinese have done, therefore, vis-a-vis the 85%, is to enhance their substantive ties with these countries. And give you another example, Indonesia. After Indonesia made a decision to build a fast train with China between Jakarta and Bandung, the Biden administration sent a team and said, be careful, be careful. And the Indonesian response was, okay, why don't you, America, come and build a fast train in Indonesia? We'll be happy if you did so. But, again, the US couldn't compete with China on that. So I think, therefore, the Chinese have had, as I explained in my book, Has China Won, a consistent long-term strategy on how to manage pressures from China, from the United States on China. And the best way to do so is to ensure that the rest of the world has a vested interest in not cutting off China. That's a strategic decision they made ages ago. And you see this in ASEAN. For example, in the year 2000, China-ASEAN trade was only 40 billion US dollars. In 2022, it hit $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. So all this interdependency between China and the rest of the world mean that China has preemptively killed any containment strategy by the United States. And see, by contrast, the United States doesn't have a long-term policy that can counterbalance China. And actually, what the United States has now with the Trump administration is the exact opposite, because Trump is actually, in one way or another, going to alienate a lot of countries in the world. I'm sure Canada is mad as hell. I'm sure Mexico is mad as hell. Colombia, I'm sure, is now mad as hell, even though it kowtowed in the end. When people have to kowtow, they get mad.
Of course.
Ironically, if Trump goes systematically threatening country by country systematically, including friends like Japan and South Korea, then frankly, Trump could be a real gift to China that keeps on giving.